Okay, so how did the Industrial Revolution affect people in Britain? Industrial Revolution, we've obviously been studying, we know it's big changes, a big change, it's mostly caused by new inventions. You've got people, as a result, and more people are working in factories and living in cities, so an increase in urbanization. So how did this big change affect people in Britain is what we're looking at. And we're going to look at how it affected three different groups of people, um, because society is divided up in people's minds and then kind of sort of in reality into different groups of people. And sometimes it's divided into what I call different classes of people. And at that time, this system was really important. People thought a lot about what class they were in, and it was quite difficult to move out of those classes. Still exists today, but a bit less so. Not much less so, but a little bit less so. We'll look at that though in a second. So at that time, society split into three groups. At the very top, you can see the person at the top who's smiling, looking very happy with himself. That is the upper classes. We'll look more at them in a moment. Then you have the middle group, who are called the middle classes. And then the bottom group are the working classes. And we'll look a little bit more in this lesson and this video at what those three different groups are. It's not so different from our time now. Obviously, there are billionaires who are the most powerful people in society, so they'd be at the top of our pyramid now. You've also got lots of people who are in the working classes, and people who are in the working classes, as we'll see, don't have much money necessarily that they've got in their savings, and so even when things are difficult, like they are now for many of us, they still have to work. Whereas people at the top, if I was a billionaire right now, I wouldn't be making this video. I'd be on my yacht, or I'd have bought myself an island, and I'd be staying there while the COVID problems were going on for everyone around me. And if anyone wanted to come near my island, I'd have got myself some security guards, and they wouldn't get anywhere near me because I'd have the money and the power to be able to do that. While most people would have little option. They have to just carry on working because that's how it is, because you don't have those same sort of choices, but you don't have the same sort of money. So let's move on. Let's look at this group. They're called the upper classes, and the upper classes at that time were mostly people who were rich because they had huge amounts of land. They were landowners. They might also have a title that they'd been given by the monarch, by the king or the queen, and perhaps had been passed on through their family. So they might be called a sir or a lord. So these wealthy landowners, they didn't have to work, because what they would do is they would rent that land to other people, and they would then farm the land and they would receive the money. And so they would spend most of their time doing not very much. They might be interested in politics, and so they might decide to become a member of parliament or something like this. They might just decide that they want to spend their time enjoying time in a club and drinking with their friends. Also absolutely fine, because of course they could choose how they wanted to spend their time. Those are the upper classes, sometimes called the aristocracy. Then below them in the hierarchy is the middle classes. So this group of middle classes is huge, and it covers quite a lot of different jobs. So what it means really is someone who doesn't work with their hands. So it's non-manual workers. And at the top end, so at the wealthiest end, these could be lawyers and doctors who've gone to university, perhaps like the men in this picture here, who've made a good amount of money and are living a good life. And the opportunities for them became even more during the Industrial Revolution, because as society became more complicated, there was more opportunities for people like lawyers, and people with money, of course, wanted to see doctors and were prepared to pay more for good doctors. And so I'd be able to live in a house like this. At the other end of the middle classes were people who just owned a small shop. or who worked as a secretary in an office. So people who really didn't have a life like this, but they weren't manual workers. They didn't work with their hands, making things. Instead, they were using their brains. And these are people, thousands of them, and their life was changing during the Industrial Revolution. More and more of them are moving to cities. Now, we're going to look mostly at the life of the working classes, and we know that working class people now. We know that these are people who have to work with their hands, so they are called manual workers. Many of them would be working in factories. Some of them would be working as servants in other people's houses. Huge numbers of working class people moved from this countryside into the cities, and as a result, they lived in conditions like the ones you can see here. You can see that there is huge overcrowding. They were living in what are called slums, so overcrowded areas. This is a really fantastic picture because it shows us so much. It shows us that lots of people, if you look at the right, lots of people were living in the basements of houses. Look at all of those shoes. So people living in basements without any natural light. It looks a bit grey to me. I know it's a grey picture, but it's very grey because it was polluted, because at that time coal was important, as we know, and coal was burnt in the factories, but also in people's houses, which meant that it was constantly smoky in the streets. As you can imagine, the people in this picture don't have much money, and so if they became ill with diseases like cholera, it was very likely that they would catch the disease, because look how close they all are together, and there was no treatment available to them, and so lots of people would die from terrible diseases. Now that's the living conditions. What about the working conditions? Well, as we know, huge numbers of people were now working in factories. About 80% of people worked in factories by the end of the 19th century. This is a woman working in a textile factory. If you were working in a factory, you'd work between 12 and 14 hours a day. Think about that. That is a hell of a long time, particularly if you're doing a job like this unlucky woman here, because it's very mundane, which means quite boring. And it's also hard work. She's standing up. She would be standing up for 12 to 14 hours. And also, she might, of course, after a while, think, oh, I'd quite like to talk to someone else who's there. If she was to talk during the job, she would be fined. If she decided that she really needed the toilet, but it wasn't her break, then she would receive a fine. And so, although her income was really, really small, if she was to break any rules, she would be fined and lose some of the small amounts of money that she was making. Factories love to employ young people, really young people, younger than you. From the age of 9, children would work in factories if they were working class, which meant they hadn't had the chance to really go to school. It was exceptionally dangerous because these young children, one of their key jobs would be to try to fix the machines if they got broken, and often they would end up having limbs crushed by these powerful machines once they'd started again. Also, if I was a young child and I was told I had to work for 12 hours a day, it was quite likely that I would misbehave, or I would not follow all the rules. The factory owners thought of this, and so if that boy at the front there, for example, he decided to talk to his friend or to do something silly, then they would grab him by the ear, they would put his ear next to a table, and then they would nail a nail into his ear with a hammer. Ouch. If I was working that amount of hours and I was his age, I'd also quite likely get really tired. Now, if he was so tired that he started to fall asleep, the person who managed the factory for the factory owner would grab him and would take him to a bucket of very cold water and would put his head into the water to wake him up. It was tough, extremely tough working in these factories. That was the experience of people in the Industrial Revolution times.